Hello and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar to launch our latest publication, Blessing or Bloat, Non-Academic Staffing in New Zealand Universities in Comparative Perspective. My name is Oliver Hartwich and I'm the Executive Director here at the Initiative, and it's my pleasure to welcome the author of this report, Dr. James Kierstead, and our special guest, Professor Gaven Martin, Distinguished Professor of Mathematics at Massey University, but actually on the line to us today from North Germany, from Plön in Schleswig-Holstein. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Oliver.
We want to launch this report here, Blessing or Bloat, and it's about staffing in our New Zealand universities. As the subtitle says, it's a comparative study because we want to also look at how New Zealand universities compare staffing-wise to other universities in English-speaking countries. And our colleague James Kierstead, who's also still a lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington, spent the last year digging through statistics of New Zealand and international universities, trying to figure out how these universities have developed with respect to their staffing levels, both for academics and non-academics. The format of the proceedings today is as follows. We will first hear from James. He will give us a summary of the report. We will then hear comments about the report from Gaven Martin. And I should mention that Gaven also wrote a wonderful foreword to the report, for which we're really grateful. And after that, we will open it to your questions. You can log your questions via Slido. It's very easy. You go to slido.com. I've actually just posted the code that you need to put in via the chat. It's a simple code. It's 2266548. So that's 2266548. Slido.com, log your questions. You can vote on other people's questions, and I will then ask the most popular questions to James and Gaven. But for now, my pleasure to invite James to tell us about the report, which has already received, by the way, great coverage. You were on Mike Hosking this morning. You're going to be on 9 to noon tomorrow. This is all a sign, actually, that this is a really relevant topic for our discussions, especially in the context of the staff cuts and academic cuts, actually, that we are facing in our New Zealand university system. So we're really grateful for your report, for your research, and now we're curious to hear your findings. Over to you, James.
Well, thanks very much, Oliver. I will just share my screen, and I will press play on the PowerPoint. Okay, so hi, everyone. I'm going to start by just briefly outlining some of our assumptions and our goals for this project. So first off, Michael and I are both clear that universities need non-academic staff. Non-academic staff in IT, student support services, and other areas have been really helpful to us in our work as academics. And neither of us envision a world of universities without any support staff. The question is just whether there can be too much of a good thing. In other English-speaking countries, and especially the US, there's a lively debate about how many administrators universities need and whether excessive numbers of administrators in some areas may be contributing to things like higher fees for students, an overwhelming ideological skew on campuses, and even the ongoing crisis around freedom of speech and academic freedom. So our primary purpose here was to get out into the public realm some solid data about the numbers of non-academics at New Zealand universities. And note, by the way, that our figures are for non-academic staff, so it doesn't include career academics in administrative roles, so provosts and vice provosts and assistant vice-chancellors and assistant provosts, that kind of thing. Those are career academics. We're not focused on them. We're focused on non-academic staff. All right, so I want to just dive into the numbers right away. And our most important figure was how many non-academics in total there are at New Zealand universities. As you can see in the pie chart, the majority of the staff employed at New Zealand universities are not now lecturers or professors. They are now non-academics. So here, beyond the simple categories of academic and other staff, the Ministry of Education, which is what we got the figures from, Ministry of Education also lists research only and research support staff. And in our report, we've counted the research only staff as academics and the research support staff as non-academics. And the Ministry of Education, we double checked with them and they said that's basically right. But anyways, the pie chart makes clear, wherever you put the research staff, non-academics would still be in the majority, which is pretty obvious, right? Because they make up 53% on their own, the non-academic or other staff. All right, so at this point, you might be wondering, great, well, how does this compare to other similar university systems? Well, and our report does have in comparative perspective in the subtitle. So we did compare non-academics as a percentage of total staff in New Zealand universities with the percentage at universities in the US, the UK, and Australia. Sadly, we couldn't get any Canadian figures for this one. So as you can see from this graph, New Zealand has the highest percentage of academic staff of any of the countries that we looked at, 59%. And in fact, Australia and New Zealand were the only countries in which a majority of university staff were non-academics. And the proportion of non-academics in New Zealand is even higher than in Australia. Another question you might have is how much of our university's budgets are going on non-academic salaries? And here, unfortunately, we could only get hold of the data for 3 universities in their annual reports, Otago, Canterbury, and Auckland. So that's what OCA stands for on the chart. So we're not entirely sure that the proportion of their budget these 3 universities spent on non-academics is actually representative of what all 8 of New Zealand's universities spent, but it's the best that we have to go on. And we know that these 3 universities are spending a healthy amount of their total salary budgets, some 45% of their total salary budgets on non-academic salaries in particular. And that's about the same proportion as Canadian universities spend on non-academics. It's more than the proportion UK and US universities spend on average, and it's a bit less than Australia. Nonetheless, it's clear that this represents quite a significant outlay, quite a significant financial outlay in New Zealand universities. It's almost half the total salary expenditure of at least these 3 universities. All right, so the final topic I'll briefly discuss here is the composition of non-academic staff at our universities. And that just means what kinds of non-academics are employed at our universities. And here there's been something of a sea change over the past 20 years or so. You can see this in the 2 pie charts on the slide. So the one on the left shows the main categories of non-academic that our university system employed in 2002. And the one on the right is the same breakdown for 2021. And I hope our designer will forgive me because she made these beautiful graphs for the actual publication, which looks very professional, but I wanted to actually get some more glaring colors so I can pick out some categories and talk about them. So the most obvious thing you'll notice here is that in both years, most non-academics were employed in this rather vague category of advisory and general support staff. That's the kind of blue one, not light blue, but sort of mainstream blue. And in fact, that category has increased over the past 2 decades. So it has an even larger share now than it used to. But I actually want you to take a look now at 2 categories that have seen their share of the administrative pie grow substantially over the same period. So first, take a look at the gray slice of the pie. So that's student welfare staff, and they've seen their share of the pie more than double. So next up is executive staff, and they're in the light blue. And they again have seen their slice of the pie grow hugely from 2.7 to 5%. All right, so if these 2 types of non-academics are taking more of the pie, who's taking up less of it? After all, the pie obviously adds up to 100% in both periods. Well, here, take a look first at the yellow category of technicians, which saw their share of the pie more than halve, from 18 to 8.9%. And then take a look at the librarians, who are in the orange color there, whose share shrank from 8.6% of non-academic staff to 4.4% in the same period. So this increase in more managerial roles, together with a decrease in more technical or hands-on roles, that's actually a wider phenomenon, and it's one that we can find in other English-speaking countries over the last couple of decades or so. And it's one which gets plenty of discussion in the research literature on this topic. So we find it in the UK. If you look at the top left, the graph there, that second bar, the only category that declines in the UK, consists of technicians of various sorts, lab technicians, IT workers, and so on, nurses. And the third and fourth bars in the graph for the UK in the top left there, third and fourth bars soaring upward in the center there, they encompass more white collar workers like student welfare and public relations staff. So they've grown hugely over the same period. In Australia, which is the next graph down, so bottom left, support staff is the only category that declines, right? The bar on the right. While the senior and middle management categories, first 2 bars, they surge ahead. In the US, which is the final 2 charts there, it's actually non-professional staff that show the most obvious decline. So these are non-academic staff, but they're described as non-professional. So they're sort of not as qualified as the professional non-academic staff. And that's the yellow line there, and you can see that one goes down. And meanwhile, there's the green line, which is professional non-academic staff. And they decline very slightly or they grow slightly, depending on whether we're talking about public research universities or private research universities. But you can see the overall trend is the same, that you have sort of fewer white-collar, highly qualified non-academic staff. And so you have more of those and you have fewer less qualified blue-collar non-academic staff. Those people, their numbers get smaller, and it seems that they're being outsourced in all of these countries. All right, so those are the only graphs I wanted to briefly discuss. And I'm looking forward to hearing all of your questions about why you think these figures might be interesting. But before I do, let me just briefly indicate some of the reasons why we think these numbers are important and are worth discussing. So the first is the most obvious. Right now, our universities are going through serious financial difficulties. And though non-academic salaries don't account for as much of university budgets as academic salaries, they still represent almost half of university's salary outlay, and that is a substantial amount. Second reason we think these numbers are important is that they show that non-academic staff now make up the majority of total staff at New Zealand universities. And that's something that we think might surprise a lot of members of the public who might assume that the tax money is going to universities to support learning and teaching. And that for them probably means lecturers, professors, researchers, rather than non-academic staff. The final cause for concern is that the now quite large bureaucracies which have formed at New Zealand universities might in some areas be distorting the true purpose of our universities. So again, taxpayers might assume that the true purpose of these institutions is furthering learning and knowledge. And it's true that most non-academic staff probably help with that mission. But we now have 3 different surveys suggesting that substantial proportions of both academics and students at our universities feel uncomfortable discussing certain topics while on campus. So there's a crisis of free speech or academic freedom. And some of these topics, like the Treaty of Waitangi, that they most often say that they have trouble talking about, they're also in the remit of many of the administrators that we find in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in that space at universities. And while we didn't actually collect numbers for non-academics in that specific space, we think that's cause for concern and maybe for further research. All right, but that's it from me for now. And I know that Michael agrees, my co-author agrees that our main goal in doing this was really just to put out some high quality data on non-academics at New Zealand universities, because a lot of the data is not out there in New Zealand that is out in other countries, and it's allowing them to have a lively debate, and also a debate that's grounded in facts and figures. And so we wanted to stimulate an empirically grounded debate here as well. So I'm looking forward to questions.
Well, thank you very much, James. It's now my pleasure to invite Gaven Martin to share his thoughts with us. And I just want to introduce Gaven a bit further. He is a distinguished professor of mathematics, of course, at Massey University. And he is one of New Zealand's finest mathematicians, one of the finest mathematicians the country has ever produced, described in the media. He is one of our most decorated and distinguished academics, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us on this webinar. And thank you again for providing us with a foreword to this report. So over to you, Gaven.
Okay, so thanks for that. Well, the feeling I got when I first started reading this report was, well, yeah. And the reason I keep thinking that is because most of the academics that you discuss with, that I meet from day to day, are pretty well aware of the enormous growth of the bureaucracy of these universities. And so, it was like preaching to the converted, to myself and others. But I think the authors really have to be lauded, because now they have clean data on the table, stuff that we can look at, and it's come from outside the university sector through the ministries. This is all data that the universities have reported on themselves. So its veracity can only be brought into question if the university's reporting is also brought into question. So it's really great to have these things on the table we can move forward from. I think the authors have been quite cautious in drawing inferences from the data, but I don't think I will be. If you look at the data from, say, 2018, that was the last PBRF survey, they record something like 21,000 employees from the universities. That's not including outsourced services to university, 21,000. That year was PBRF round, and that was the first year that there was no gaming of the system. Everybody involved in teaching and research had to put in a PBRF portfolio. There'd be no penalty if they didn't score. There was something like 7,000 PBRF portfolios awarded. So that means that actually just 1 in 3 people employed by New Zealand universities are active in research and teaching. 1 in 3. And that's not to look at the significant number of portions of academics who did have PBRF portfolios and who were significantly involved in administration. Many academics have 20–25% of their time set aside for service, and many of those are academic roles. But those are pretty stunning numbers. Imagine if you walked into a high school and met 30 people at random. How many would you get? 30 employees at random. How many would you guess were teachers? Well, it would not be 10, I don't think. So this burdensome academic bureaucracy has come about because sort of every conceivable activity within a university has now been named and labeled, and somebody, usually some sort of manager, is associated with measuring and looking at that activity. They're in HR, they're in PR, they're in all sorts of activities that you would not normally associate with a university. But they do not appear to be there for the sake of efficiency. They're mainly there, I think, to dilute responsibility. Once you create sort of a labyrinthine bureaucracy, there's no accountability anywhere up the chain. It just diffuses on the way up. And that's really a problem, especially if you're trying to get things done. This structure is now just a dead hand lying across our university sector, stifling innovation. It's a really troubling thing, actually. But also, this level of bureaucracy serves to set up a divide between us and them. It used to be the university was a collegial environment where you met people, you talked with people, and everybody had a mission. And these days, there's no raison d'etre for universities in the sense that everyone feels that they're contributing to the greater good. Don't think vice-chancellors think anymore that they're in it for the better of the country. There's a section in a report on vice-chancellor salaries, and I think that section shows that actually vice-chancellor salaries in New Zealand are pretty average, and there's really nothing to look at. But I think the real question there is not about quantum, but about quality. Do we have the sort of people that we need to lead our university system into the future? There are other things you can draw out of this report. The decline in technicians. Well, technicians are the people who come in and set up labs, assist with tutorials and those sorts of things. Where has that work gone? There are certainly no fewer labs or tutorials or those sorts of things. A lot of that technical work has been pushed down into academics. One of the things I felt reading this report was thinking back to a 70s sitcom, Yes, Minister. There's a very well-known skit there where Humphrey is explaining to his minister why a hospital without patients should need more bureaucrats than a hospital with patients. And that was because you needed additional bureaucrats to keep themselves busy and to look after the staff and find forms for them to fill in, to keep them active as well. I wonder if there's just not an incredible amount of busy work going on within the university, work that does not need to be done, but somebody has a name, an area to cover, and they are actually involved in sending interminably long documents or new policies or revising this or revising that, instead of carefully thinking about what the university needs to look like. Well, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gaven. Could I invite James now to respond briefly?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gavin. Yeah, I mean, maybe we should have had more sort of anecdotes from academics about their experiences of administrative bloat or the rise of administrators in the university. I guess what we wanted to do is really kind of take those anecdotes as a starting point and then see what was really going on, and as it were, kind of prove or suggest by the data what was actually going on. And we actually surprised ourselves, because when I started this project, I thought that we couldn't possibly have more non-academics than in the US and American universities, because there are all these lurid headlines about Stanford, for example, having so many administrators that you could give every undergraduate student a butler. But actually what we found is that on average, New Zealand universities have more, and that's partly because obviously the United States is a big place, there's a huge university system, and places like Stanford and the Ivy League universities or colleges, they're pretty atypical, actually. They're untypical of the rest of the states. So yeah, I was actually quite surprised to see that New Zealand was so high, and actually sort of with Australia in a lot of these counts, especially the crucial one of non-academics per academics. So Australia and New Zealand are kind of out on their own and having more non-academics and academics in our set, but New Zealand has even more than Australia. Yeah, I'll just note that you said that our data comes from university reporting. It does ultimately, that's correct. So mostly what we use is the Ministry of Education, Education Counts website, but ultimately those are universities reporting their own figures. So exactly as you say, if these figures are wrong, then something's gone wrong with the university's sort of data collection, right? The divide between us and them, I think that's a great point, actually. And again, that's something that we sort of hear a lot about anecdotally, and I think it's probably true, and I've had the experiences of this myself, but we couldn't really quantify it. Maybe that's something we'll try and do in the future. But I mean, my own experiences as a lecturer at Vic, I mean, one of them is that, in the classics program or classics department, when I first got here, we had a lovely, helpful administrator or administrative office. We had actually 2 or 3 separate people working there, but it was someone who knew the department quite well, knew the students quite well, was just down the corridor. So I could literally kind of go, old-fashioned stuff. I could just walk down the hall and ask these people questions, about where I needed to be and what I needed to do. And the university took those away from all the departments, and they put them at a higher level, at the level of the school. And I think that kind of trend is seen in lots of different parts of the university. And recently I had to do some administrative task. I can't remember what it was, but I got called to some building, and I thought, I don't know where that is. So I looked it up, and yeah, it's there. On like a new, more recent version of the campus map. I went over, it was by the gym, and I went into this new building that I'd never seen before. And I walk in, and there's this huge open office. I'd say there were probably something like 50 or 60 administrators working in there. And I mean, they're all hard at work. I'm sure they're all good people, but it just was interesting to me how divided these worlds now are. The old model was that the administrators would be sort of working with us to help the students and further research, and a lot of them still are doing that. But it's more and more the case, it seems, that they're putting them in these sort of central services units. And that, as you say, I think does produce this weird kind of parallel worlds phenomenon.
There's absolutely no doubt that these front-facing staff that interact with the academics, that interact with the students, and can help people find their way through the university, are incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and the final thing I'd say is that with the vice-chancellor salaries, I mean, we have to sort of say what was up with the data, which is just that if we compare our vice-chancellor salaries on average with all these other countries, the vice-chancellor salary, the average vice-chancellor in New Zealand isn't extraordinarily high. Having said that, New Zealand vice-chancellors do make a lot of money. Now, of course, New Zealand universities can argue, well, we want to get the best people, and that's the market rate. We didn't want to come down on one side or the other of that in the report, because maybe it's the market rate. Maybe we do need to pay people that much to get talent. But there is a whole debate, including among professional economists, about executive pay, chief executive pay especially. Does it actually reflect true market rates, or are there lots of factors which can actually distort the signals and mean that you're not actually getting, the exact price that you should be getting?
Well, one of the things that universities are going to say in response to a report like this is that the excessive bureaucracy is there in response to government's requests or continued requests for information, that the reporting requirements are such that we need this size of a bureaucracy to do that. is there any way we could find out whether those sorts of responses are valid or not?
Well, I mean, I don't know.
That is the first question here on Slido. You've suggested reporting
Okay.
on number of administrators employed in DEI. Would it be useful to report on FTEs involved with different government required mandates? That's exactly the question, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be very helpful. I mean, I think one of the things we're trying to do, well, one of the things that we do in the report is just to say, these are the figures. And so there may be some explanation for why New Zealand's figures are higher, but at the end of the day, New Zealand universities are not larger on average than Australian or American ones. They're not more complex on average than these other institutions. So there's something that we're doing in New Zealand that means we have more non-academics in these other places. And that seems like an option, right? Because it's an optional add-on, because you can do universities like Australia does with slightly fewer. You can do universities like the UK does with a lot fewer. And so we're doing something else. And yeah, we don't exactly know, precisely why that is, but it's something we need to question, because it's not just a result of, New Zealand's far away or something. It's not a kind of natural thing. It's something that's part of the institutions that we're running.
And back to the question, would it make sense to report specifically on some government mandated employment figures?
Yeah, I think that would help a lot. I mean, this is one of the things that we actually recommend at the end of the report, is just that we need more facts and figures out there. And, especially for these politically sensitive subcategories of non-academics who are working in diversity, equity and inclusion, or so-called diversity, equity and inclusion.
Yep. Well, let's take more questions then from Slido. They keep rolling in. And just a reminder, you can ask your own question at slido.com. The code is 2266548. And first question here is actually, we're taking them in order of popularity. What are the implications of your research on the growing debate in universities around free speech, and how does it feed into what we are seeing overseas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point I made at the end of the presentation is the crucial one. It's just that there are these non-academics, and there's also career academics in administrative roles who are in charge of things like Mātauranga Māori or diversity, equity and inclusion, or one element of those. And again, this is sort of anecdotal, but I mean, at Vic, there are these big posters, and they also have them on these big screens, these same images. And they say, like, Vic has a no tolerance approach to issues of sexuality and race and so on and so forth. And, in some ways I think, of course, we don't want to be racist or sexist, but often those posters seem to me to be kind of enforcing a certain view about issues which are actually still incredibly controversial, and they're a subject of ongoing controversy. So I'm not sure it's appropriate actually for some non-academics or administrators at the university, or actually for that matter for academics at administrative roles, to be kind of foreclosing the debate in that way. And one of the problems is, I mean, I as a lecturer, I don't really know the status of those posters. I mean, if I disobey those posters and start debating things, will I get in trouble? And who am I going to get in trouble with? And what authority do they have over me? Does their authority trump the authority in the Education Act, which says explicitly that lecturers and students have the right to discuss issues that are controversial among the general public? So I just think all of that needs to be more transparent and more debated. And I know that I'm not alone in having these questions. And I have lunch, or I have people reach out to me by email quite often saying similar things. I'm worried about these creepy signs. I'm worried that, they have a feeling that certain views are mandated from on high. And as I say, sometimes it's by these career academics in administrative roles, but often it's also by these sort of offices, and the fact that they seem to be a part of the university institutional structure means that a lot of academics, who really tend to be just very intellectual people who want to focus on their work, they're going to be a little bit intimidated by that.
Gaven, I saw you nodding, but I hope that this would not be such a big issue in mathematics as it would be in the humanities.
You might be surprised, but nevertheless, I think that one of the things that being a senior academic allows you to do is to look back. And I remember what was happening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, although I was a child in the 60s. Was that actually the public view of universities and its progressive nature was driven by the students. It was the students who were deciding the way forward. And actually the academy at that time, both the academics themselves and the administrators were probably rather conservative. So the universities led at that time towards what I think is actually ultimately a far better society. But I think these days, these sorts of initiatives are now being driven down from the top more into the university, no longer the students leading per se, which is not to say that the students don't agree with what's going on, because I think in many cases they do. But it is really a different thing if you're somehow sandwiched in the middle as an academic and you have certain views on issues that may well be aligned with the actual facts of the matter, but you're uncomfortable in stating them. You're uncomfortable about saying these things in classes. Well, why? Because the students might not agree with you. That's okay. You can usually talk with them. But when a senior administrator comes along and says, you can't say that, or you shouldn't do that, and they do say these things. So, there's a power structure there to enforce their opinions down the ranks. Now, it's not like they send jackbooted soldiers into your office and take you out, but there are very subtle pressures all the time. You're up every year for review, for promotion. These jobs are being disestablished. These people are making decisions on who stays or who goes.
See, next question then, and I think the question answers itself almost after what you already told us. If each academic has more administrative support now than they once did, has that meant a commensurate drop in admin work for academics, or do they create work, Gaven?
There is no doubt that there's been an increasing amount of administrative work passed down into academics of all sorts.
Actually, could you give us some examples, perhaps?
Well, firstly, performance reviews, 20-page documents that need filling every single year to look over instead of some sort of holistic approach. But equally, student demands have changed. You used to show up to a lecture and present your lecture, meet students with class, meet them in their tutorials and discuss these things. But now you have to prepare not only your cast, but an online presentation, PDFs, or the assignments and model answers have to be typed up and those sorts of things. So quite a lot of additional work these days, which wasn't there 10, 20 years ago. There are so many more committees across the university these days. There's a committee for almost every activity, whereas there was a lot of spontaneity in the past about, the seminars and so forth. Group of students wanted to learn or hear about something. You would just march into a room and you'd lecture them for a couple of hours or maybe a couple of hours a week, something. Those sorts of things are no longer allowed. It all has to be going through some formal structure. All this work has to be identified. There's absolutely no trust now between the academics and the bureaucracy. And that is one of the great shames of this growth in bureaucracy. There's complete disjunct. Nobody trusts anybody anymore within the university sector. And I'm wondering if, in fact, the increase in administration is because the government no longer trusts universities to divest itself of the money that is given to them. But this real lack of trust is something that, creates a burdensome bureaucracy in and of itself. Everything has to be dotted on the line, crossed on the T. There's no acceptance that you're working hard to do these things. I mean, academic productivity is probably higher now than it's ever been in the past. And it's certainly not because of the administrative load. It's just because of the way society is demanding more and more from this group of people.
James, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that are actually praiseworthy that the non-academic staff do, but which still raise questions about whether we need to have that done within the university. So I'm thinking this week, for example, I think it was Cook Islands Maori Language Week. And I actually am really interested in Pacific languages. And so I think it's kind of cool. I get all these emails about Cook Islands Language Week and Tongan Language Week and Samoan Language Week. But it's the kind of thing where you think, well, do we need all those extra activities to be nested within the university? And another one, which actually is controversial and one that I think we should have more of a debate about, is you saw that there was this big increase in student welfare staff. Now, I think one of the reasons for that is that, for example, we have therapists, we have help for mental health on campus, and that's in response to an apparent growth in student mental health problems, some of which I think is definitely real. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do that in-house. And I'm not saying it's a ridiculous idea. I think it's a perfectly reasonable idea, but I think it's one of those things that we have to debate. Like, what does the university do? What are its core functions? And what things can we leave to either the market or the national health system or somewhere else? And I don't know the answer to that when it comes to therapists, but there's lots of things like that where it's sort of like the university has kind of gathered these services, these things into itself that, not all of which are absolutely necessary part of the university. So I think we need to talk about that.
I think, James, the point to make there is that it's also coming out of a fixed quantum of dollars. By doing these additional things, you have to do less of some other things. It appears apparent that they're not doing less administration, right? So what less activity is going on within the academy? Because somewhere these activities have to be paid for, right?
Well, in Australia and New
like
Zealand,
the government gives extra money to do these things.
In Australia and New Zealand, it looks like they're saving the money because they have such large class sizes. So there's a very high ratio of students to staff in Australia and New Zealand. So I think that's part of the equation. And that with the cuts at the moment, they're also focusing really on class sizes, even though there's lots of educational research that Michael Johnston can tell you that suggests that small class sizes are actually really good for educational outcomes. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the strange features of this, that actually the ratio of non-academics to academics is there's lots of non-academics per academic in Australia and New Zealand, but there's not lots of non-academics per students, because there's lots of students in Australia and New Zealand per academic and per non-academic. In other words, the student staff ratio, all types of staff, is very high. And I think that's where they're making savings, basically.
So what you're saying is that they're making this calculation, on one hand, research and teaching and learning quality against student experience quality or student support quality. Yep. And they're choosing the latter over the former, despite that act defining the mission of the universities as the former.
Yeah, and that's where the debate has gone in the United States. I think we're not quite there yet here in terms of what's going on at the sort of poshest, fanciest American universities. But there you really do get this kind of effect. Stanford actually is an example, even though I love Stanford, did my PhD there. But it's almost at the point now where it's kind of like a country club for the undergraduates. They have everything on tap. They got grand pianos and Olympic swimming pools and, fully kitted out gyms for free and all this stuff. And so that's one thing that you can do if you have a massive endowment and you have people paying a lot of money in fees in your private institution. It's still questionable there if that's the best way of spending that money. But in public institutions where you're getting taxpayer money, you really have to, I think, focus on the core functions of these institutions, especially at a time, by the way, when, Michael's work and other people at the initiative's work has suggested that actual standards at secondary schools and also in the early years of university are very low, and they're declining quite rapidly. So you think, we really just need to focus on that, just sort of reading and writing and math and basic math skills, even at first year level of university.
I've got a question for you, Gaven. The report is obviously about English-speaking countries and the comparison of New Zealand universities with other universities in the Anglosphere. But you, I can see from your biography, have actually worked and taught in universities outside that sphere. I see in your biography you spend time at tertiary institutions in Germany, in Finland, in Sweden, in France. So the question I have for you is actually, is what we're discussing today, also this lack of trust between academics and non-academics, a specific Anglo phenomenon, or have you encountered similar kind of phenomena in universities outside the Anglosphere?
Okay, so what I can say is that within New Zealand, I've worked sort of within the bureaucracy and administration at basically all levels. I spent time on the council of the university, involved in, head of department or head of larger institutes and those sorts of things. So I have seen inside New Zealand bureaucracy to a greater extent than I have as a visiting academic. However, having said that, as a visiting academic, if you show up at some of these places, I just showed up at Kiel recently, they have a front-facing administrative team. There are about 60 academics in the math department here. That team consists of about 6 or 7 people, and each of them knows exactly what's going on. I was told exactly what I had to do, the forms I had to fill in, because this is Germany, right?
Yeah,
and, but at the end of the day, it was, complete triviality. And they were very friendly people. They knew exactly what to do. So I was settled and working in no time flat. It's those sorts of people that are now missing from the university, where we've just built a big brand new building on my campus that houses maybe 100 academics. There is one front-facing administrator in that entire building. And I guess she's been made redundant. So there's that. I mean, it makes you wonder what the heck is going on. This centralization is really, really problematic. And it's not something that you see to the same extent in the rest of the world. And I might add my experiences, well, at Oxford, it's sort of different, entirely similar, but also in Finland, University of Helsinki, and those sorts of things. Really good front-facing service staff that get things done for people. They know how to work, they know who to contact. And those sorts of things are now missing.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I mean, obviously, we actually had a lot to do in the report, just looking at our set of English-speaking countries, which we basically chose because they're sort of culturally similar. And I think a lot of the language used in universities in Australia and New Zealand and the UK and Canada, for example, the term Vice-chancellor, they're really similar. So we didn't really get a lot of time to look across the world. That would have been a huge project, but Oliver did encourage us to look for some continental European data. And we did find a paper which suggests that the UK, number of non-academics per academics in the UK isn't so far off places like France and Germany. But with New Zealand, especially New Zealand in the past few years, 59% of total staff are non-academics in New Zealand universities in 2021. That's still highly unusual. We've actually only found one country in the world that has a higher percentage of non-academic staff, and that is Iceland, which, obviously there's reasons why Iceland might be an anomaly because it's incredibly small. I don't know what exactly is going on there, but yeah, that's the situation we're in. That as far as we can tell, we have the highest ratio in the world except for Iceland. And we need to look more at other countries before we can say that with any confidence. But at this point in time, that's where we are.
Okay. Well, let's take the next question from Slido. Is the growth of admin staff in New Zealand universities partly due to a shift in governance where university executives are administrator heavy and academic light?
I think that's a really good hypothesis to run with. I mean, I think that there probably is a lot of growth in these particular fields. I mean, all we can do is work with the categories that the Ministry of Education uses and that the universities use in their annual reports. But I think, as we saw, like one of the categories that's growing hugely in New Zealand is executive staff. So non-academics who are working in executive staff, or in this very vague category, general support staff. And I suspect that a lot of the workers or the employees in that category are also sort of white-collar managerial types, rather than these sort of technicians who have mostly been outsourced. So yeah, I think that does play a role. And certainly there's been a proliferation. I mean, there seems to have been a proliferation of all these deanlets, as they say in the American literature. So like deans and pro-deans and assistant deans and associate deans and pro-vice-chancellors, all of those roles seem to have proliferated. We didn't count them. That's something that would have taken a lot more time because we would have had to go into individual universities' websites or annual report, or not even annual reports, actually. We would have had to sort of count them manually almost. They're not sort of just listed as a single category. But bear in mind that what our figures show here is that there's an amazingly high number of non-academics per academic in New Zealand universities. That actually leaves out all of those deans and associate provosts and vice deans and everything. So the total administrative burden is actually probably far higher even than what we've suggested in this report.
Maybe we can take the next couple of questions together because they really concern the report and actually the webinar. Have you sent the report to the university vice-chancellors? Have they responded? Are any of them enrolled on this webinar? Well, I haven't seen any yet. And if not, what should we make of that? But the other question is, this discussion would have been more balanced if a non-academic university staff member was on the panel. Was any such person invited? James.
Oh, I think the answer to that is no, because we wanted to keep it, just not more than 2 or 3 people. But I do have some friends who work in the non-academic side of Vic, professional staff, and yeah, and I sent the invitation to at least one of them. So he said he would send it to some of his friends. So hopefully he's here. And my sense from the few people that I know on the professional staff that I'm friends with is that they're not hostile to this. Actually, they sort of think that there's a bit of bloat, that they've often sort of seen this in their own lives. They kind of wonder about why there's more people in certain categories than others. And I'm actually sort of quite sympathetic to that, because in a lot of cases, the people I know are sort of in categories which I find extremely helpful, like IT workers. They're extremely helpful, because I often don't know why I'm suddenly unable to log into this thing, or and I have to go to my lecture in 5 minutes, and that's really a godsend to be able to pick up the phone and get someone to come and help you with your computer. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I'll reiterate again and again, this report isn't saying, get rid of all the non-academics. It's just saying, look, we've got more of these per academic than anywhere else in the world. Is that sustainable? Of course, it would be ridiculous to sort of cut them even by like half or something. That would be, the university would probably collapse if we did something as radical as that. But I think it's just hard.
Are you sure?
Well, I think that, we'll put it this way. I mean, the ratio is now something like 1.4 to 1 non-academics to academics, or 1.5 to 1, depending on how you calculate it. So if it went down to 1 to 1, that would still be like pretty high internationally. So we couldn't cut half. We might be able to cut a third, and that would still be high internationally. But I mean, I don't want to joke about this, because obviously with people's jobs, there's a lot of serious considerations that go into it. And, the university is organized in a certain way. These are complicated decisions, but yeah, the numbers are very high. Sorry, what was the first question?
First question was whether we got any responses from vice-chancellors.
Oh yeah, not yet. We also put out a policy point a few weeks ago, because we heard that the Victoria University Vice-Chancellor was using the wrong figures. He thought that there were more academics than non-academics at Vic, which I think is kind of troubling, because he should have the right figures, especially when he's making these really serious decisions. But we hope to engage with the vice-chancellors in the future, and we're going to try and set up some meetings with them, and we'll see whether they are keen to engage with us.
Gaven, any thoughts on this?
No, let's move on.
Okay. Next question then. Did you look at changes in academic performance by the universities as the non-academic support levels changed?
No, we did not. I mean, that would have been great. There were so many other things that we could have done. It took quite a lot of work just to get the basic numbers down and to compare them with all the different countries. But that would actually be quite interesting. I guess just thinking out loud, I mean, the problem is, how do you measure academic performance? I suppose there are various sorts of standardized tests, but yeah, I'm just thinking out loud, because we frankly just didn't get time to do that, but it would be interesting.
But the academic performance is measured, I mean, with these international rankings every year. And if you look at the international rankings, they don't look too bad for New Zealand universities compared with the rest of the world, until you drill down into them and see where New Zealand universities score high. New Zealand universities score high because these ranking systems give a high score towards universities that have most of their staff with PhDs from somewhere else. Well, in a place like New Zealand, those are all very high. But once you start looking at publications, their quality and their citations and those sorts of things, New Zealand universities score by and large quite low. So I don't think that this academic, this level of administration that we have is helping New Zealand universities in that regard.
Yeah, and there's a lot of strange distortions with those world rankings. So there's a major one called the academic ranking of world universities that's run out of China. And it seems like vice-chancellors in Australasia are really keen to do well on those rankings, because they think that Chinese students look at them. And if you look at how those rankings rank universities, they don't punish universities at all for having big classes. So in other words, if vice-chancellors in Australasia are just looking at that, there's no incentive for them to actually do what's, educationally productive or educationally helpful and have small classes. They can blow out the classes as big as they want, because what those rankings are measuring are other things, like the things you mentioned, or research productivity just defined by papers. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting in university policy for the past few decades, is that when these world rankings first came in, I remember dons and lecturers back in England, where I did my undergraduate degree, sort of scoffing at them and saying, oh, it's so ridiculous. No one's going to pay any attention to this. But they did. And I think that it just goes to show all you have to do is set up a ranking system and people will want to climb up those rankings. And I just think that at the end of the day, these vice chancellors in public universities in Australia and New Zealand, they're really meant to serve the New Zealand and Australian public. And of course, it's good to have international students as well. But the focus should be on the quality of the education. We give them tax money to provide good education and good research. We don't give them tax money to climb up rankings in China. I know the argument is that you get more students in from abroad, but I do think that there's a danger that the incentives get distorted in that way.
But I don't think that's the only argument, actually. I think that before ranking systems, we were all told how world-class our university systems are, how fabulous this, that, or the other is. And until you have something, at least anything, right, you're just talking to yourself. Now we have an objective measure. It may be faulted, and but you can dig down into these objective measures and try and get a sense of what's going on. Before that, we had nothing. It's like PBRF. A lot of people don't like PBRF, but until we had PBRF, everyone was just talking, oh, X is good. Why? Because, well, he's been around for a long time and he seems to know a lot, but actually he's contributing virtually nothing. And those sorts of things get quantified and measured. And I think that the New Zealand university system is a lot better for having PBRF, although with the most recent changes, we'll see how that works out. But till now, it's been quite good.
Yeah, I basically agree with you that it's better to have some system of rankings and assessment rather than nothing. But I think it's really important to think about what exactly is going into these rankings and which rankings people are chasing. That's really my point. And we can refine this through time. We can sort of get better at assessing ourselves.
Okay. Well, if you see a smile on my face, it's because of a most popular question right now. What type of red wine is that behind Gaven? I would be tempted to rule that question out of order unless you want to tell us. But well.
The great thing about living in Germany is that alcohol is basically free. I mean, I go to the supermarket and I buy high quality beer, and it's $2 or $3. I get left for $2 or $3 a bottle. But
well, maybe that's something for academic productivity and creativity as well.
But the red wine is a Cru Bourgeois.
Okay. Well, I think maybe we'll leave the wine question there and go on to the next one. Although I have a feeling we might have already answered that before. If there are more non-academics to support each faculty member and student, are New Zealand academics more productive? Well, I think we answered that already. But are students better served as a consequence? I mean, you had this statistic on the rise in welfare staff, and there is a demand for these services. So are students better served at least?
Well, that's the weird thing I was saying before, how the number of non-academics per academic is really high in New Zealand, but the number of non-academics per student isn't that high. So there's still lots and lots of students per non-academic, something like 18 students per member of non-academic staff. So that's quite high. So that's the strange thing, is that actually we're not really serving the students. It's like we have all these non-academics and the majority of staff, but there's still more students than you would expect. So yeah, there are these three elements everywhere: academics, non-academics, and students. And the peculiar kind of configuration of them in Australia and New Zealand is peculiar. It's different than other places.
But do you think then that
serving students is a loaded question, right? Why do students come to university? Basically to learn, right? And is the administrative structures that we're building supporting student learning, or is it supporting other things? That's the real question, right?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah. And that's why I think, again, we need to have this conversation about what exactly are these student services doing. And some of the things they're doing, I think, do clearly support student learning. I mean, like having librarians, clearly you need that. Having IT help, you need that. And then there are these categories in the middle, like as I say, sort of student welfare, student mental health services, where you can make an argument that it's helpful because they need to have help on campus, but you know, there are lots of other institutions where you wouldn't do that in-house, right? You would do that through the health system, or you do that some other way.
But about what of those things are actually supporting their learning? You know, the things that support their learning might be technicians and those sorts of things, right? More lab demonstrators in classes, more tutorials, those sorts of things. But those are exactly the roles that are being cut back and replaced by middle-level management.
Yeah, so that's right. So that what the New Zealand university system really has to justify is the idea that high levels of managerial staff are actually serving students, and I think that's a little bit harder to justify. Again, like, you can't run a university in the modern day without any managers, so there's going to be some. It's just the question is just why there's so many more in New Zealand. So other similar places seem to be able to run university systems, and actually, frankly, kind of much more varied and impressive university systems with fewer people than we have.
So in any case, I assume you wouldn't be able to answer this question then here. If student welfare support has approximately doubled, have we seen a corresponding increase in student welfare? I mean, what kind of measure would you have for that?
Well, no, I know that's wrong, because in fact, there's all this stuff about there's all this work on student mental health crisis or general mental health crisis. It seems to be the case that depression and anxiety are rising in the general population, and especially with young people. And as I said before, some of that must be real. I mean, some people think that there's an extent to which it's just the sort of expansion of certain terms like depression and anxiety. But I think that a lot of it is real, and it's a serious problem. But yeah, the question is just, so I mean, it may be that you have to be careful. It may be that having mental health support on campus is actually helping, and that we would have even worse levels of student mental health if we didn't have that. But what I'm just saying is that there seems to be this presumption that everything has to be done on campus, and that's the only way of doing it, and that's the most helpful thing. It may actually turn out that if you have students going through the regular health service to get therapists, it actually improves their well-being more. I don't know. I just haven't seen any discussion of that.
But also, you'd have to say that only 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 young adults is actually at university and able to access these services. And this mental health crisis is not restricted to university students alone, right? So what happens out there away from this sort of closeted environment?
Yeah, that's a good question.
We have been flooded with questions on Slido, and I could ask you another, I think, 20 or so. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the webinar. So what I want to do instead is actually ask you about possible next steps. What do you think needs to happen now? What kind of measures do we need to collect, and what kind of political discussion would you like to see in the future on this topic?
Well, I mean, what we say in the report is just that we think this topic should be discussed more often, and data should come out of the sort that we gathered and made public here more often, either by the Tertiary Education Commission or by the Ministry of Education, or by the Tertiary Education Union, or the New Zealand Initiative. I mean, someone I think just needs to discuss this more often. I'd say with regard to the ongoing financial crisis, again, we're not sort of saying to the universities, you need to fire these people in particular. There's a hugely complicated and sensitive decisions. What we're saying is just, look, these are the numbers, and so you need to take a hard look at this. And it may be that you can justify it and say, oh, actually, we need this because of something to do with what the government mandates. Fine, but you need to really think hard about this. And I think people need to be able to debate it openly. And I think if we go from there, then there's hope that things will improve. And
Gaven, what would you like to see?
I think that this report is part of the wider malaise of New Zealand university systems. And I think it's really time that governments actually all politicians got together and had a hard look at the university system and asked, what should we expect the university systems to deliver, and are we optimally placed to deliver that? I think the report shows quite plainly there are problems with the current structures, and actually the funding crisis itself shows that. So I think that there does need to be this big external look at the university system, and I think that needs to be done as quickly as possible. However, within the university system, I think there is also opportunities. I think that somehow university vice-chancellors and councils, they need to look down inside themselves and say, does this work really need to be done? Do we really need these numbers of managers? Do we really need a deputy assistant associate dean for the something or other? Does that position really need to be there? Does it really need to be 20% of somebody's time? And if not, God, these jobs used to be filled normally within the everyday activities of people and of academics and non-academics alike. But now that they're given labels and then they're expected to have a fraction allocated to them, those fractions are never reflective of the true load. If you get an administrative role, it either takes up virtually none of your time or virtually all of your time, no matter what the fraction is. So these things need to be looked at carefully and critically.
We couldn't agree more. They need to be looked at, they need to be discussed, they need to be debated. And that was the whole purpose of this report and the purpose of the webinar. So James, congratulations on your report together with Michael Johnston. Just mentioned again, you can download the report on our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. There will be more discussions on this report. I mean, starting tomorrow with your appearance on 9 to noon on Radio New Zealand. But I think there needs to be a much wider discussion, actually, especially in the context of the crisis that our university system is in. We hope to have made a contribution to that debate with this report and with this debate. And I thank both of you, James and Gaven, for your contribution and all of our listeners online for their questions as well. This is the first report from us, but I think it won't be the last on this topic. And for now, that's it. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you again in the future.
Thanks, Oliver.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.